It is that time of year again, people. Let's talk about Nintendo Switch possibly getting Game Boy games on Nintendo Switch Online. This is something that's been rumored for a long time, and it kind of rears its head every year around September because of the fact that, well, Nintendo Switch Online launched in September, and because it is a yearly subscription service, every time we hit a new September, there's kind of this idea of, well, is Nintendo going to do some kind of value add to make people want to subscribe again and keep their memberships going? Now, I have seen this rumor kind of get kickstarted mostly recently thanks to MVG and Nate the Hate, who did a podcast talking about the possibility of this being added. And part of the real evidence for this is the idea that back when the original Nintendo games were added to Nintendo Switch Online, there was actual code you could find for 4 different emulators that would work on the Nintendo Switch. Now, we have 2 of those working so far with the original Nintendo and the Super Nintendo, leaving 2 more that are a mystery. And of the potential systems that it could be, Game Boy really does seem like the safest bet. I do think it's important to emphasize that with everything we're talking about and hearing right now with Game Boy, it is once again conjecture and rumor. There is, again, some scant evidence that certainly would make sense that we could be seeing this feature getting added soon, but with Nintendo, I think you always have to kind of apply an extra heaping spoon of salt because they have a history of being a little more unpredictable than people would like. Either because there are things that would make sense they don't follow through on, and other times, while it may seem like they're building up towards one thing, they come at you with something entirely different, for better or for worse. The prospect of getting Game Boy games on the Switch is really exciting to me, and I know there are a lot of people out there who have their hearts set on other prospects like the N64 or the GameCube, but one of the reasons why the idea of Game Boy is so exciting to me is because I feel like a lot of times that library doesn't really get talked about as much. Yes, there are some amazing classics on the N64 and GameCube that a lot of people are familiar with, but the Game Boy, while being an older system, has a treasure trove of some fantastic games. Now, some of these are very obvious. Of course, a lot of people would be hoping to see stuff like Pokemon Red and Blue, Pokemon Gold and Silver, or even Pokemon spin-off games like Pokemon Pinball. But there are a lot of other Nintendo franchises that had great entries on the older Game Boy systems. With Mario, we had the Mario Land games. Mario Land 2 in particular is one of my favorites. We got Legend of Zelda titles, which we did get a remake of Link's Awakening on the Switch, so it'd be really cool to have the original version playable on there as well. And of course, Oracle of Seasons and Oracle of Ages, some of my favorite top-down Zelda titles. There's Kirby games, the original version of Metroid Samus Returns, and I think one of the most interesting games to think and talk about, Donkey Kong. The Game Boy version of Donkey Kong is based on the old school actual Donkey Kong arcade game, but what was really interesting about that particular game is the fact that it was one of the few titles that really made heavy use of the Super Game Boy. The game looked and played fine on the Game Boy screen itself, but if you put it in a Super Game Boy, it had redone music and way better looking visuals that really set it apart and made it feel like an entirely other game. Now, we did get the Game Boy version of Donkey Kong on the Virtual Console for 3DS, but that was still playing the Game Boy version of the game. And considering how Nintendo has played around a little bit with the games they've been putting on Nintendo Switch Online, for instance, the SP versions that have slightly different rules or give you infinite lives, other kind of benefits like that, I'd be really intrigued to see if they ended up adding something like Donkey Kong 94, offering both the Game Boy and Super Game Boy versions. And really, that's just talking about stuff where the name recognition is still really big today. There are a lot of great Game Boy titles out there that are not necessarily as talked about as often. I think one that in particular stands out for me in my memories, I grew up playing a lot of Solar Striker. This was a top-down, vertical scrolling game on the Game Boy that was a ton of fun as a shooter, and I would love to have easy access to that on my Switch. And so yes, there are some amazing N64 and GameCube games that I would love to see come to the Switch at some point, but I'm still very excited at the prospect of getting Game Boy. But at the same time, this rumor making its way around also brings me down a little bit. Because when I think of Nintendo Switch Online and how this is currently Nintendo's answer of bringing a lot of older games to the Switch, I can't help but feel like they've dropped the ball just a little bit when it comes to how they support their older titles on current platforms. Really, the only ones that supported it properly were the Wii being able to play GameCube games, and then the Wii U being able to also play Wii games, and that's really it. But meanwhile, on their handhelds, there has been a history of a lot of backwards compatible support. The Game Boy Advance, for instance, supported all the way back to the original Game Boy, Boy. Even the couple first runs of the DS with the DS Lite supported all Game Boy games along with those new dual screen titles, and the 3DS fully supported the DS library. And for a time, between the 3DS and the Wii and the Wii U, we had Virtual Console, something that gave us not the ability to play your actual old physical games on these new platforms, because that wouldn't actually make sense, there would be no way to physically do that, but made a select number of popular titles from old platforms available as individual purchases. Now this is something that people made a lot of big deals about when the Nintendo Switch was launched, because it did not have Virtual Console. We didn't know what their solution was going to be in terms of that, and it ended up being that they just dropped it entirely in favor of Nintendo Switch Online. A service that I do think is actually pretty cool in its own right and is worth the money, but as the only way that the Switch supports these older titles, aside from the occasional individual port or remake, has me a little bit worried. Preservation is something that I found myself talking about more and more this past year, and the fact of the matter is that out of all the companies right now, it really does feel like Nintendo has not been doing the best job of it. Sony, for instance, has not been great, but the PS5 does at least still support PS4 games. They thankfully did not take down the PS3 and PS Vita store. Xbox, meanwhile, has been supporting all the way back to the original Xbox for select titles. It doesn't cover every single game out there, but it's great that you can actually have some games you play from way back when. Well, with the Switch, Nintendo has been very heavily investing in what to me feels like the Disney Vault. Instead of having some kind of centralized, easily accessible method of playing older games like, say, what Xbox is doing with their own services, Nintendo instead has leaned heavily on the idea of constantly bringing games back in limited fashions. This is either through making them as standalone games that are made available for a limited period of time, like we saw happen with the Mario trilogy that is no longer available digitally, and so you have to track down physical copies, the English localization of Fire Emblem, which finally happened last year, and then was taken off the market. And also just in terms of how they've tried to find ways of making these older games available in different forms. For instance, we had the Classic Edition systems for a time where they did the NES and the SNES having a number of games on them, some of which are now available via Nintendo Switch Online, but not all of them, and vice versa. There are plenty of games on Nintendo Switch Online that didn't make it to these physical consoles. Or more recently, what we're seeing them do with the Game & Watches, which are based off the old school style Game & Watch, but are featuring a small number of games to play on. We had the Mario one that was just Mario, and soon we'll be getting a Legend of Zelda one that features 3 games. And while Nintendo Switch Online is an affordable and convenient way to access multiple games at once, it's not actually a thing that, based on how it's being handled right now, is going to allow you to permanently have access to these games. It requires an ongoing subscription. So however much time passes when Nintendo moves on to a new platform, what is the solution there for being able to play those games on your Switch still? If those games are not made available on a later platform at some point, or do you simply lose access because, guess what, Switch Online is done now, we're on to the new thing, and this is no longer around? Look, and to be clear, I'm not necessarily against the things that Nintendo is doing. I think Nintendo Switch Online, again, is a convenient way of doing this all at once. I think the physical systems have been a really cool little collector's piece, but ultimately, if those are the only way that these older games are going to be refreshed time and time again, that's a problem. With how expensive it is to track down and play a lot of these older titles, I can't help but just think time and time again how I would love to have an official digital way of playing these. Yes, there is always that easy answer of emulation, and sure, if a game is not made available anywhere else, if there's no way to find it, I'm all for people doing that. But I would love for there to be an actual officially supported option from companies like Nintendo that makes a lot of these games accessible to current players, those who don't necessarily have the know-how or want to go out of their way to emulate, or those that just want to support having those games made available on a larger platform. Nintendo Switch Online ultimately feels like a very temporary solution because of the nature that it is a subscription service, and it's especially annoying when really Virtual Console already kind of had the right idea, but then was dropped because of, well, it's a new eShop and we're going to handle things differently. And that's the exact kind of situation that I'm just afraid of seeing perpetuated again and again. If we got some kind of cool solution that made all these games available, I would love for it to be forwards compatible moving into next generations, but based on how Nintendo's been handling all this, I don't think that's really something they're aiming to do right now. So yeah, I'm excited about Game Boy games possibly coming to the Switch. I do hope that is the thing that happens, but I would just love to see Nintendo take that extra step forward and offer some other method that's longer lasting to have access to these games. But that's at least just what I'm thinking right now. Let me know down below in the comments what you guys are thinking. Do you think Game Boy on Switch is an actual possibility? Would you rather it be something else? Do you think Nintendo Switch Online is just going to be NES and SNES forever? Let me know down below. As always, if you enjoyed the video, like it, subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you guys later.